most of the time, I just don't get it. The world, I mean. All the noise and meanness and condescension. Often I find myself feeling like Bartleby at the wall. To quote a lyric from a song written in 1971, to believe in this living is just a hard way to go. Thank you, John Prine. And thank you all. How grateful I am then for our anonymous donors who find a university reading series a worthy investment, and for an audience willing to brave the cold and invest an hour of your life in poetry. For poems, each offering their one thing, just give me one thing to hold on to, and most especially for the writers who make them, who understand the work of making art is the work of living, as the poems in Peter Balakian's new collection, Ziggurat, make clear. From the poem, World Trade Center, Black Holes, 74. I was trapped in similes I hated. I couldn't leave my head, and so the sound was insidious, then beautiful. Then it was there. If I say I once heard bird-boned pipes in an old church in the Caucasus, like this wind blowing in the tracery of the top floors, in the pipelines, and farther up. Through the glass, I could see the other tower wavering, the silver like broken mica. I was falling matter dislodged by the idea of a place from which nothing can return. Jackie Wilson's tremolo, Paganini's broken wires, the frantic shaking of the small bells at the altar, going up into some place beyond the smudged out sky, above the radar needle, above the planes coming out of the fog on their way to Newark. It was possible to hoist an object out of a black hole with a rope. This bit of knowledge I was hanging on to. As my colleague and dear friend Margot, who will often interject when moved by some bit of real talk, lighting upon a complex truth in our conversations, say that. Longing for a poster of an old rodeo, I find Balakian's essay falling into a rug, some notes on imagination and artifact. He writes, the Kashan attracts me too because of its organic nature. It's still alive in some way, alive because it's made of fine wool and spun by women, men, and children in the villages and towns of Iran. It's made by hand on looms by women and children, knotted with almost hypnotic rhythm, with precision and knowledge of concept and form. And then there's the color, the fabulous part of the art, the brilliant, resonant, evocative, often variegated tonality of color. The dye makers, like the weavers, are heroes in this art. They are assigned to the task of making beautiful color that will last. If the colors don't last, the rug loses its presence, its art. The older it gets, the richer and more complex the colors get. One might think of the dye makers as being a bit like alchemists. They take matter from the organic world and distill it and transform it into something they hope will be permanent. They use roots, herbs, leaves, stones, dirt, berries, the crushed thorax of the Kermes insect, the shell of a mollusk. Dye makers are like poets, using everything they can for their art, compressing and transforming their stuff to make something that will outlive them. Dye making as ars poetica. Safflower, my dyer's thistle, carry me on your burr, so I may always feel dry gusts at my neck. If the color lasts, the art will last. Peter Balakian is the Donald M. and Constance H. Rebar Professor in the Humanities and Professor of English at Colgate University. He is the author of 5 books of poems and 3 prose works, including The Burning Tigress, The Armenian Genocide, and America's Response, a New York Times bestseller, and Black Dog of Fate, a memoir, winner of the PEN Albrand Prize. Thank you, Peter Balakian, for helping me to believe in this living. Please welcome Peter Balakian.
Thank you. I feel like, I don't know if I can read that one poem now, because you've done it better than I can do it, and I was planning to read it. But I'm grateful for your voice. And it's great to be here, and thank so many of you. Karen, thank you for your work on this event. Alice, thanks so much for having me and having me into your class just now. John, thanks for the interview we just did. I reflect on how much Alice and Bob and John, your voices and your words continue to mean in our curriculum down the road in Colgate. And it's great to be here in this just literary community, one that has a great tradition and seems to be alive and thriving all the time. And I have too, I just say briefly, so many, I just have a lot of great memories of being on this campus. I was recalling the first time I read here was in the latter 80s, and I read in a place called the Temple of Zeus, am I right? And wow, that was still a memorable place to have read, around statues and busts and columns, and it was good. And my sister was here later in the early 90s doing a PhD. I then translated a book of poems from the Armenian with Nivart Yalyan, who is a member of the biology department and the human resources administrative staff. She's no longer living. So I did a lot of, intensified language chipping here. And our daughter was an undergraduate here in 02 to 06, and there have been a lot of nice readings in the Armenian zone on campus and meetings with the Armenian Club. So it's good to be back, and I thank you for coming out. I'll tell you, last night as wind chill hit clearly -5, I was thinking this is an empty room today, but at least the sun came through. I would like to read a few pieces from a couple of books and then have as much conversation as you would like to have about anything: art, life, language, poems. In my new book, Ziggurat, one of the things that instigated really the book was a phone call I got days after the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Towers. It was a fellow writer asking me, and I gather, a lot of writers, to do a piece on 9/11, as we now call it. Could I do a piece on this and have it in by the end of the year? I said yes, knowing full well that I couldn't. But what it did was get me to get on a train in Utica, in that wild neoclassical train station. If you've ever been in it, it's like 10 temples of Zeus's. And I took a train down to Manhattan in the latter part of September, a couple weeks after the attacks. And the perspective you get on reality from a train window, I find always valuable. It has been. Trains have been good places for me to write. And so this poem emerges from that train trip. It's called Going to Zero. A canvas with less turpentine, more hard edges, less bleeding. That was good for beauty. Frankenthaler in Art News. In the dining car, crammed with parkas and laptops, microwaved cellophane, plastic plates and canvas bags. And the valley under fog, as the cows disappeared. And when the green came back into view, I could see the SUVs floating on the thruway, the cows oblivious to the revved engines of trucks. The river glistened all the way to Albany, and I could see flags on Baptist churches and resurrection trailers. God Bless America on pickups. United We Stand laminated to billboards as the fog settled, then lifted. And when I woke, a flag the size of a football field hung from the gray tower of the GW, where the tractor trailers jammed beneath its hem as something sifted down on the silver-plated Hudson. And then the lights went out. 2. The faces on 7th Avenue blurred in the chaos of vendors and Liberty scarves, freedom ties, glowing plastic torches, dollars and polyester. And inside Macy's, I was hit by cool air as Stars and Stripes Forever floated down from women's fashions into the quiet aisles of Aramis and silk scarves. I wanted to buy the Frankenthaler, a modest early print, minimal, monochromatic, surface and perspective in dialogue, on 24th off 10th. The gallery still smelled like wood and plaster. But I didn't stop, and when the train reached the stock exchange, the Yom Kippur streets were quiet, and the bronze statue of Washington was camouflaged by National Guard. I was walking my old mail route now, like a drunk knocking into people, almost hit by a cab, until the roped-off streets cut me at the arm. At Broadway and Liberty, the fences wound around the bursts of dust rising over the cranes and bulldozers, over the punched-out windows. I stared through a piece of rusted grid that stood like a gate to the Crystal River. I was sweating in my sweatshirt now, the hood filling with soot, as I watched with others drinking Cokes and eating their pizza of disbelief. 0 began with the Sumerians who made circles with hollow reeds in wet clay and baked them for posterity. At Broadway and Liberty, at 20 floors charred and standing, at Miasma people weeping, Anna's nail salon, Daikichi sushi, the vacant shops stripped clean in the graffiti of dust-coated windows. Something blasted from a boombox in a music store. Something in the ineffable clips of light disappeared over the river. So I made that trip down, September of '01. And as I began to think about the gaping hole in Lower Manhattan, I began to think back to my own boyhood when I worked as a mail runner. That is M-A-I-L, mail runner. I ran mail for a steamship company in Lower Manhattan. It was my first job, my first real paying job. I was 15 when it started, sort of the mid-'60s. And I ran, my job, among other things, was to get big checks from the company that owed my company money into the bank before 3 every day, because the interest lost in checks of $200,000 and $300,000, and this was the '60s, so those are $1 million checks today, right? The interest lost on that was significant, so they hired somebody just to be on the check beat. I got to know Lower Manhattan very well. I knew elevators, those old accordion elevators with their elevator operators who smoked, 3 cigars at one time. I knew those elevators, I knew back alleys, I knew courtyards and foyers of great buildings of Lower Manhattan, 25 Broad, 80 Broad Street, 23 Broadway, Wall, Maiden Lane, Ann Street, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing that happened, curiously, as I go back and work every summer there, I'm a suburban kid from New Jersey, I'll say more about that shortly. All of a sudden one year, there's this huge excavation that's begun, and these things called the World Trade Towers are being built. And you're delivering mail every day, you're running around the city, and this construction's happening. I recall delivering mail to the North Tower within the first days that it was open. The first 49 floors were open for business. The rest of the thing was being built, right? And it was a sort of interesting notion that you were delivering mail to a structure that was still under construction. It was massive. Didn't think all that much about it. I mean, it made its energy, and you picked it up. But when the towers went down, that whole part of my life came back to me with a different kind of perspective. And I really began dreaming back, to use Yeats's phrase, to those experiences of running Lower Manhattan. The towers came back to me in various forms and ways. They also began to interest me as spaces of imagination and perspective, spaces that I moved in as a kid when I was beginning to think a little bit and write a little bit as well, because I actually kept this job on even into my early grad school years. So there was a lot of strange experience spent in those spaces, and never underestimate what can happen to you in an elevator. So this is called World Trade Center Black Hole 74. Lyrae's already done it better than I can do with it. But she didn't start at the beginning, so I get to start at the beginning. I have a series of these poems that are kinds of meditations. This is World Trade Center Black Holes 74. I may have flunked physics, but I was full of black holes and wind that was slamming the tower as I rose in the glass box up to the 80th with a check from Chilean lines. Black holes opened relativity, created frozen stars. In the sky lobby on the 99th, I loafed over headlines of John Dean's testimony and the suicide of a CEO. I heard the relativity of the wind. Everything was like. I was trapped in similes I hated. I couldn't leave my head, and so the sound was insidious, then beautiful. Then it was there. If I say I once heard bird-bone pipes in an old church in the Caucasus, like this wind blowing in the tracery of the top floors, in the pipelines and farther up. Through the glass, I could see the other tower wavering, the silver like broken mica. I was falling matter dislodged by the idea of a place from which nothing can return. Jackie Wilson's tremolo, Paganini's broken wires, the frantic shaking of the small bells at the altar, going up into some place beyond the smudged out sky, above the radar needle, above the planes coming out of the fog on their way to Newark. It was possible to hoist an object out of a black hole with a rope. This bit of knowledge I was hanging on to. So this book somewhat evolved out of that cycle of tower poems, and simultaneously I got interested in a kind of inquiry into Andy Warhol's silk screens. I got interested in Warhol silk screens. The visual art has meant a lot to me in my work over the years. And I got interested in particular in the Warhol silk screens of the early 60s, the ones in which he, in a kind of edgy and weird and quasi-abstract way, took on contemporary events, as nobody had ever quite done that kind of thing, both in that medium and both with those events. And for me, it was also a way of negotiating or using the medium to inquire, to re-inspect historical moments I lived through. This is called Warhol Electric Chair 63, right? And it's if you know that set of silk screens Warhol did, this is the green and red one. He did a few electric chairs. And it was done to, how can I say it, commemorate or note what was to be the last act of capital punishment in New York State at Sing Sing, the prison up the Hudson. Warhol Electric Chair 63. The red spreads like Christmas wrapping. The green, a field in a Caucasian rug. It's almost beautiful without the metal plates for the head, though the plug on the floor is visible. Before decorator colors and Hockney, Calvin Klein in the summery Hamptons, before there were switches to break the flow, my mother used to say, never touch a radio when you're in the bathtub. Never fly a kite near transmission lines. But still it's furniture. Still it's a typical American way to go. It's Sing Sing, the silhouette of Ethel Rosenberg. In the rheostatic air, the absent man heard, "She loves you." The British invasion and the flat line arrived at once. Outside, Negroes were eaten by dogs. Johnson was sworn in. Cuba turned red in the Green Sea. There is in the center of this a book, a 43-section poem called A Train, after the famous subway line. Ziggurat, to engage the ziggurat at Ur, the great Sumerian skyscraper, if you will. I mean, often called the first great skyscraper in Western culture history. And elegy, A-Train Ziggurat elegy. The idea is that there are four strands of experience happening to the persona who is riding the subway, the A-Train. As he's doing so, he's reading a book called The Excavation of Ur of the Chaldees, The Excavation at Ur by Sir Leonard Woolley, the great British archaeologist who dug up the ziggurat in the late 20s and early 30s in what is now Iraq. So Persona's reading this. He's on the A-Train. He's dreaming back to a relationship he had in a previous period of his life, set in Manhattan, in which there are various interactions throughout the poem. And during this period, a former student of his has been almost killed. A former student of his who was a news reporter, an anchor man for one of the big stations in New York, was nearly killed when an IED blew up on him in the Iraqi, as he was covering the Iraqi war. Okay, so those are the strands that are intersecting. And during this time, too, there is one section in which the towers are watched on TV as they come down. Most Americans have had that weird, unsettling, complex, virtual engagement with that event. I'm not sure what that makes us in our relation to the event it's a problem. So I want to read. I thought I'd like to present the poem, and the best I can do is try to read 6 sections, just to give you a flavor for it. So here they are. I'll start with 1. I've been interested, I would say, in the long poem as a form, the sequential long poem for a long time. It's popped its head up in my work in various ways, but this is the longest I've taken on. 1. The tender head of the he-goat on the cover stares through the branches of a golden tree. And I'm just moving on a system of fuses while the fruit stands of Spanish Harlem fly above. And even now, remembering when we were here after Nixon waved goodbye and rose in the chopper. Even now, seeing it through the double glass as Ur of the Chaldees revised and updated Sir Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur, flares on the yellow cover in the momentary dark that wrapped our bodies all night like violent paint on the sheets, like the broken fire escape of our building. At 125th, the guy next to me reading Another Country. The white guy passed out in a suit and brown bag. The steel screeches the tracks and the vaults light up. Section 4. I ran mail a whole summer down Greenwich and West before it even started. Before we roamed Radio Row for 78s of Ellington and the Blanton Trio, before the yin-yang of real estate, under the Kensett skies, over the river, the wrecking balls took Radio Row down. Florists, groceries, record shops, restaurants, the whole mid-century slid into a pit, and the sun made Gothic trees of the falling windows. Out of res ipsa loquitur, out of Port Authority and Chase, Rockefeller and Tobin, the Twin Towers rose from the garbage. 7. We met at a party in a loft on Green Street, in the no gravity of Barsamian's big canvases. Post-Magritte, you called it, a vagina and no head, breasts but no limbs. The red wine was Chilean. This was after Allende and Neruda. I watched your mouth in the dark reflection of the window beyond which the light of the towers glared the black red. But still, the need to ask, who wrapped the day in nectar? Who cracked the sun over the hedges? Who saw the light flare off the towers at dusk? What's lost, if not an open grave where the heart's eaten by worms? Section 22. On the street, I heard that the Indians were like cold-blooded dancers at high altitudes, Mohawks who had come down from Canada. I watched them glide with hot rivets and cold steel into the azure of near oblivion. Some days they disappeared in light as if the narrow beams of air came undone, and they floated between steel and blue like the lost angels of the Karachi. My head spiraled from the fumes of coffee and yellow bulls, red cranes, green trucks, pale blue drilling rigs, bull's liver, gooseneck, clamshell, orange peels, 192,000 tons of steel. Just to clarify, the Karachi are the great Renaissance painters of those great ceilings, not the city in Pakistan. Section 27. I'll go in 27 and 28. And that'll be it. It was true. The Armenians got to Jesus first, at least officially, ahead of Rome. And this devastated you because you had believed all those truths of catechism, all that dogma which spelled backwards is humiliation and extravagance. The kind of thing Fellini made you see in Roma. And we left the Angelica laughing at your confirmation dress and your mother's anxious rosary you carried in your purse. Who is the other who floats between what you see and what is there? Think of the other going silent. Screen fuzz smoke hours away on TV. Came as dumb smoke into my house. The jade plant leaves, tongue of the cat, pan on the stove, the cardamom and clove moved in their currents. Outside the sky was searing blue, honeysuckle wafting through. There was nowhere to go. Sat down, got up, stared at the iBook, walked around. No phone service. The cell's dead too. Read one last poem from the Ziggurat book. I know certainly all the writers, and I greatly enjoyed talking to the MFA writers last night, and I know they recall, many people in this room recall a moment when great language first, hit you, hit you where you live, and it sort of changed your life. Here's a poem that reflects on that, one of those moments in my life. It's called Reading Dickinson, Summer '68. I was a football player. I was a running back. I was recruited to play football in college. I know it seems weird now, but that's how long ago it was when you could play college football at 5'9", 175 pounds, And people at Cornell, kids who played running back at Cornell were that size in those days. Now, of course, every team has to have, a dozen people over 300 pounds. It's another sport, and frankly, it scares me. But that's another subject. But in this moment, me, the reader of Dickinson, is playing ball. It's football time, but poetry has come into his life, and there's a kind of double weave going on in the knot of his brain. Reading Dickinson, Summer '68. In the hermetic, almost dark, under the fluorescent diz, I found her broken nerves, smoke coming off the dashes, the caps like jolts to the neck, the pried-open spaces between vowels where the teeth bit off twine and the tongue was raw, then cool with ice. The air of the stockroom after lunch was the marbleized silence of the small blank pages she stitched into privacy. Air of paper and faint glue, bond, carbon, graph, yellow pads. In the stockroom, I could read alone. The confetti of money dissolved on the blank wall. After work, I slid the numbered poems on blue mimeo into my playbook and felt the open field, the zigzagging past cornerbacks, the white lines skewed to heaven. Excuse my mood, unbridled, chemical, her scrawled messages smooth to the mind. Excuse my absence, again, and yes, then, too. The cold stone of the Palisades was there after we split, alone, naked in the Hudson, the water greasing me in the tepid chemical mix, before I returned to the cement of 9W in my father's Skylark, the night black and soundless within. History has engaged me in many ways, but the history of the Armenian Genocide has been a history that's had a particular pull on my imagination. And in my memoir, Black Dog of Fate, there's a lot about my maternal grandmother, who was the only surviving member of her family of more than 40 who were massacred by the Turkish government in the first week of August of 1915. Her story is, a significant part of this book. It's not the only part of it. And her impact on my life and my head has been large. She died when I was 13, but the experience of her is ongoing in some way. And I didn't really know her story while she was alive, although I knew fragments of it. So I want to read just a few paragraphs from Black Dog of Fate and then one poem that engages the Armenian past. The genocide of the Armenians, I suppose, can be called a template for genocide in the modern era. Hitler did say 8 days before invading Poland in 1939, who today, after all, speaks of the annihilation of the Armenians. So it did inspire the Nazis in a number of ways to commit genocide in the next generation. And genocide remains an ongoing epidemic, clearly. When I was with my grandmother, I had access to some other world, some evocative place of dark and light, some kind of energy that ran like an invisible force from this old country called Armenia to my world in New Jersey. It was something ancient, something connected to earth and words and blood and sky. Now I realize that my grandmother's stories hibernated in me until I was ready to understand them fully. Or maybe marinated is a better word, since we're a people so steeped in food. Marinated, or is it cured, like grape leaves in brine, or lamb cooked in apricots, walnuts, and pomegranate juice, and left to soften and harden fat in an earthenware jug, or long slabs of filet mignon hacked in garlic and cumin and left to hang in the dark air of a basement. My grandmother liked to tell all of us her dreams, but it was to me when we were alone that she told her stories. Perhaps she had told some of them to her daughters when they were young, although no one ever mentioned them. I came to realize that my grandmother's stories were part of time and not part of time, part of place and not part of place, part of the stuff that's stored in the mind's honeycomb. My grandmother's experience figures into various poems over the course of various books, and just to do this small poem called Ellis Island, one of those places of nexus for American history, Ellis Island. The tides of Bach Cantata, the beach, the swollen neck of Isaac, the tide's a lamentation of white opals, the beach is free, the Coke machine rusted out. Here's everything you'll never need. Hemp cords, curry combs, jade and musk, a porcelain cup blown into the desert, stockings that walked to Syria in 1915. On the rocks some ewes and rams graze in the outer dark. The manes of the shoreline undo your hair. A sapphire ring is fingerless. The weed and algae are floating like a bed, and the bloodless gulls, whose breaths would stink of all of us if we could kiss them on the beaks, are gnawing on the dead. And to finish with two poems from a book I'm working on, a couple of new poems. I appreciate you listening to them because they've never been read, and I frankly, there goes, right? 2 Christmases ago, my wife and my son and daughter and I decided to get away for December, the holiday time, that can be so crushing to the psyche, right? I suppose it can be good too. But holiday, especially if you're an academic and a teacher and holiday time comes and it's about grading and exams and presents and materialism and so on. So we went to New Mexico with the primary goal of just spending as much time in Native American Pueblos as we could to engage with whatever could be engaged with in the short period we were there. We found it an extraordinary experience. So several poems have come out of that experience. I'll mention one other thing about this poem that is, it plays with an idea as well from Bernard Riemann, the mathematician, Riemannian geometry, which in some ways does anticipate Einstein's relativity discovery and Riemann's interest in arguing for finite space, but infinitude within finite space. I got very interested in this notion. This poem is called Pueblo, Christmas Dance. I took a wrong turn into a sun mask on mud, straw glue, smashed yucca. If you saw them rub feathers on their arms, if the claws of bear wrapped them, if the porcupine and badger were sewn to the skin, if gusts of God flew into lightning-riven wood. All morning I drove out of one life into another, through no water and empty self. I saw the coordinates of a masthead of a wrecked car. My car took the curve of a curve just past the exit to Los Alamos, where finite space, as some mathematician said, imploded the infinite, though he couldn't have imagined the atom pressed into the cave inside the mesa that opened into the buffalo who could turn into a bear, who could be the beast. 2. She was carried between the horns of the animal. The grass brushed the sky. She drank from the horn. The hill swallowed the dirt, which became a horn of water. The horn of water was passed among many. Many drank while a chief blew yellow powder through an eagle-winged bone. So the idea of space requiring a definite form by reason of the matter that fills it up dissolved into a gourd rattle that made me feel the heart shake. In the dry cold, in the catapult past Jesus, where the bones and kernels shook in the dry skin, there was relief in a freedom from all dreary Euclidean infinities. Space is finite, but space is unbounded. I could hear the end of history in the teeth rattling inside a gourd. For a second, the blue spears of lightning shot through the 3 women sleeping under the canopy of a mud house. The sun poured on us. Okay, one last poem. with the students last night, we were talking a little bit about home, where people are from, how far people travel to be in new places. I think about the issue of home a lot, about the relationship between imagination and home, imagination and history. And when your family tree's been exploded by a mass human rights catastrophe, be it genocide or other events of similar sorts, you find, diaspora really shapes your family. I have family live down under, live in the Middle East, live in Europe, live in South America, live in North America. And at times they've lived in India and China as well. So this poem is called Home. Just to note a few things, Flinders Street is Melbourne. Larnaca is Cyprus. Maycox Bay, the Hamptons. My father and his family grew up on 116th Street and Broadway. Home. Driving Route 20 to Syracuse, past the pastures of cows and falling silos, you feel the desert stillness near the refineries at the Syrian border. Walking in fog on Maycox Bay, the long lines of squawking birds on shore, you're walking along Flinders Street Station, the flaring yellow stone and walls of windows where your uncle landed after he fled a Turkish prison. You walked all day along the Yarra, crossing the sculptural bridges with their twisting steel, the sound of the didgeridoo hollow like the flutes of Anatolia. One road is paved with coins, another with razor blades and ripped condoms. Walking the boardwalk in January past Atlantic City Hall, the rusted deco ticket sign, the waves black into white, you smelled the grilled cevapi in the Bashagia of Sarajevo. And that street took you to the Jewish cemetery where the weeds grew over the slabs and a mausoleum stood intact. There was a trail of carnelian you followed in the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem, and picking up those stones now, you're walking in a salt marsh on the potato fields, the day undercut by the flatness of the sky, the wide view of the Atlantic, the cold spray. Your uncle stashed silk and linen, lace and silver in a suitcase on a ship that docked not far from here. The ship moved in and out of port for years, and your uncle kept coming and going from Melbourne to London to Calcutta and back, never returning to the Armenian village near the Black Sea. The topaz ring you passed on in a silver shop in Aleppo appeared on Lexington Avenue off 65th. The shop owner, a young guy from Ivory Coast, shrugged when you told him you had seen it before. The shuffled dust of that street fills your throat, and you remember how a slew of coins poured out of your pocket like a slinky near the ruined castle, now a disco, in Thessaloniki, where a young girl was stabbed under the strobe lights. Lights that lit the sky that was the iridescent eye of a peacock, in Larnaca at noon when you walked into the church where Lazarus had come home to die. And you forgot or never knew that Lazarus died because the story was in one of your uncle's books that were wrapped in a newspaper, in a suitcase, and stashed under the seat of a Model T. And when he got to the border, he left the car and walked the rest of the way. And when you passed that apartment on 116th Street and Broadway, though it's a dorm now, the suitcase is buried in the closet under clothes. And when you walk past the door of the building, you're walking through wet grass, clouds clumped on a hillside, a subway station sliding into water. Thanks very much.
I was wondering if you could talk about how you would approach a poem when you're to write. What is the internal motivation that leads to a poem, or what were the series of thoughts, and then what leads to an essay or prose?
It's a great question, such a huge question. It's definitely worth, a 3-day symposium here, which we should do. Maybe I'll just try to pick up on the second part of your question, and that is, why go to the lyric form rather than the prose form of an essay? Because I've written in both forms, and most poets have. But I think the continued neuro-instinct toward the lyric comes from a bundle of sensory dimensions that language embodies, and the sensory dimensions or thought dimensions that language embodies can't be worked out any other way than in the phrase, the musical cadence, and the image density. And most poets work in phrases, rhythmic cadences, and image densities. And of course the deep drive to keep exploring experience through those media, I think have to do with the fact that the poem complicates life and scissors into it in layered ways that no other art form can. I'm willing to argue, no other art form can. Now, there are many people in different arts will argue, but we can have that argument. And that's why the poem, just remains durable, and I think of the 15-line Emily Dickinson work, and I take it over the $100 million blockbuster film, any day, which is a way to say that a culture needs its poems for what no other art form can do. So the drive to work in that zone, and often, you get going on a poem from stuff that's just knocking in your brain that may not be coherent, but you want to throw down on the page images, musical phrases, and rhythmic beats, and things start happening from that. So it comes often more out of the incoherent than anything, not always, but it comes out of that incoherent sensibility and the belief in language's richness.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your interest in collage and why that's a powerful form for you, what you're thinking about.
Sure, thanks. Alice's question is that I have an interest in collage, and that I mentioned in class this afternoon. I'm writing it. It's actually an essay, a kind of collage, maybe a collage-like essay, but it's an essay that's in a book of essays I'm working on that deals with collage as form and collage as culture. My interest in the long poem is an interest in what I would call the decentralized sequential form. And I think it's safe to say that Whitman invented a new concept of the long sequential form. I mean, before Whitman, you have long poems. They are in linear narrative structure, from Homer to Virgil to to Milton to Wordsworth. I mean, that's not that Whitman didn't invent the long poem, but he did invent the poem made up of jostling, dynamic, metonymous, and autonomous sections, so that the sections can function sometimes as autonomous poems, but that they're working toward a larger capaciousness, a larger freedom in space, in which there's a relationship between lyric and narrative in a slight way, and in which there's a play and flexibility for the bringing. I think this is one of the things that collage as an art form does, can bring intersecting discourses into relationship. The great collage painters, starting with Braque and Gris and Picasso, did this Rauschenberg's Columbines I absolutely love. I don't know if any of you remember the Rauschenberg show at the Met about 5 years ago. His Combines, he calls them, are great inventions in this form. But I think also the trajectory of the long poem from Whitman to the present is a very rich one, and I think it engages collage notions, of some of which I'm just trying to sketch briefly here, and it certainly has been important to me in conceiving of a 43-section poem in which I'm trying to get more space to move, and yet keep a tight lyricism, which is my own preference and predilection, and to be able to think more in interesting ways in that bigger space. I always note that I think Whitman's long poem sequence cycle idea is as American as jazz, the cheeseburger, the skyscraper, and the suspension bridge. You can add other things to it, but I think it's true. It has a deep American proteanness to it, a kind of restlessness with a traditional constraint, a need to do self-invention within a field of potentiality. You can think of Olson later with his kinetic space, Williams with his notion of open form, field form. So many things have come out of that space. So I'm continuing to probe it. I actually do a seminar now at Colgate on the sequential poem, and in which collage and visual arts come into the course, and we start thinking across disciplines and discourses. And it's a lot of fun to look at paintings. I think it's a great energizing thing. But again, again, we could have, we'll just keep talking about that. It's a long exploration.
I liked your book, The Black Dog of Fate, very much, but I was not really sure what the Black Dog of Fate itself was.
Just in a nutshell, because I don't want to, frankly, I don't want to give you what I think it is, because that's really for the reader to do, but it's based on a folk tale my grandmother tells me when I'm about 8 years old. And the folk tale is evocative, enigmatic, and I think it has resonance for the concept of fate and human experience and history for the tale that gets told in the memoir. And I would just say to the reader, just go back to that folk tale, just keep playing with the threads, keep teasing them out, and I hope they'll grow into something. So I thank you very much. You've been a great audience. I appreciate it.